Okay, so today we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about some interesting things. They turned out to be kind of strange in some ways, not quite as strange as what I'll be recording for the second lecture for the week. I'll try to do that today. So we're moving from epistemology to metaphysics. So epistemology is about what we know, what we can know, what's justified, what's rational to believe. So now it's metaphysics is about what's the nature of reality. Okay, so we'll cover some general stuff. Not very long. Let's see, maybe the week after next we turn to the existence of God. That's a big question in metaphysics, right? Does God exist? Now we're talking about the general nature of reality. What does reality include? So today the topic is realism. So for the thing that I record, the topic is idealism. The idealist believes that actually there's no external world. It's all internal to our minds. That turns out to be a viewpoint that sounds really strange, but it's really hard to give any objections to. So we'll find out how that goes. Today, though, we're going to talk about realism. Realism is the view that there is a world that exists outside, external to the mind, independent of what we think, what we want, what we desire, right? It is the way it is. So now the question, though, is what does that real world contain? What are the features that make it up? So if we looked around the room, we could say, what does this room contain? Is it and if I were to ask you, you'd probably say things like chairs and the podium, right? Computers, human beings, things like that. Now, video projector on there and a screen, right? Some things like that. Now, some issues in metaphysics are going to be how much of that way that we divide up the world, how much of that is dependent upon a pre-existing conceptual system that we have, okay? So this is going to be Kant. We'll talk about that next week in class. For instance, if you bring somebody in from let's say a newly discovered tribe down in the Amazons, and you ask that person to describe what's in this room, they're not going to say video projector, for instance, right? They just don't have the concept. So we divide up the world according to our conceptual scheme. What determines our conceptual scheme? Maybe our language, right, plays a role in that. So interesting thing there. But another thing is that you could push it deeper, right? So not only are there chairs, but those chairs happen to be gray in color, right? Does that mean that there's this thing, grayness, that exists, a more abstract level, right, a higher level thing? So it's not just human beings, but humanity, right, that exists. So are those things real components of the world too? By the time we get to the end, we'll look at a person who says, reality is really a lot different than what we perceive it to be. So let's move on here. We're going to talk about pre-Socratics first. It's all ancient philosophy today. Pre-Socratics, followed by Socrates, and then we end up with a guy named Plato. So that's basic outline. All right, pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics were all the philosophers before Socrates. Yeah, these divisions are kind of artificial, okay? And when you think about dividing the history of philosophy up into ancient philosophy, followed by medieval philosophy, followed by early modern philosophy, I have to tell all the students in the upper level classes that those divisions are useful, but the boundaries are really not cut and dry. Okay, so there are people. I usually make the first person in medieval philosophy to be Augustine. Okay, but there are some people who lived after him that had more in common philosophically with people that were before him than he does. Same thing with modern philosophy, right? First person in modern philosophy, maybe Thomas Hobbes or Descartes or something, but there were people after Descartes that had more in common with the medievals than Descartes. So when I think about these divisions, they're more about philosophical presuppositions, okay, than they are actual historical time periods. Same thing with the pre-Socratics. It's not necessarily every philosopher only philosophers that were before Socrates' time because there were people that outlived Socrates. This really belongs to the pre-Socratics. Socrates represents a kind of a shift in the way that philosophy is done. Okay, so that's really more how we're going to divide things up. The pre-Socratics were concerned about metaphysics. That's essentially it. A few things maybe about ethics, a couple things about epistemology. What they really wanted to know is what does the world contain, right? What is reality like in a fundamental way? Okay, now to talk about some of this stuff, we need a few terms. So there's realism and anti-realism. Realism is the view that there is a real world, mind-independent world. It's out there. Okay. Anti-realism is the view that there is no such thing like that. Or it's better to say, to some degree, there is no real world, or these particular kinds of facts aren't features of any real world. Okay. So if you're an anti-realist, you're not probably going to be a global anti-realist. You're an anti-realist about a certain domain. Okay. They're anti-realists about science. They're anti-realists about morality, so on. Some of the people who are realist about science are people who are anti-realist about morality. They believe that, yeah, what science describes is real, but what ethics describes is not. There are no moral facts. Okay, that's not a position we're going to hold at OBU. There are no moral facts, but that's a common variety of anti-realism. Okay, we also have objective and subjective. Objective says that something is objective if its truth is independent of our desires, beliefs, so on. Something is subjective if its truth is dependent on desires, beliefs, conceptual scheme, way we see the world. Okay. For example, and there are things that are just subjective. Okay, that's that people tend to get uptight when you say, oh, truth is objective, subjective. But the fact is, there are definitely subjective truths. It doesn't follow that all truth is subjective, right? But things like a lot of value claims that we make are subjective because they're relative to our desires, preferences. Value claims about food. Does this taste good?
Olives
right?
are the most disgusting thing on planet Earth. Like olives are.
Olives are, okay.
Yeah. It's the most disgusting thing.
Yeah.
That's subjective. Objective fact.
The objective fact. Okay, so somebody then says they like olives, then you have to say, no, you're just flat out wrong. Right? It is the case. Well, we have these sort of arguments like that, but at a certain level you recognize, yeah, those arguments are kind of fun to have, but they're foolish at a certain level, right? Because all you're really saying is that you don't like them and somebody else is saying I like them. There's not really any disagreement, okay, do you see? But when we talk about an objective fact, is there something here? If somebody says not, we're disagreeing about some fact of the world, right? Not just it's made true by the way we perceive. All right, so everybody got those? Realism tends to go with what? Objective. Anti-realism goes with subjective. Okay, good. All right, metaphysics. What's the nature of reality? We talked about that first day of class. Now, what these pre-Socratics are looking for is what is known in Greek as the arche. This is like the thing that things really are. Okay, so essentially what they're trying to do is reduce this diversity of experience that we have down to just one kind of thing. So I know it looks like there are humans and chairs and podiums and stuff like that, but what there really is just this, because this is what makes up all the rest of the world. Okay, that's what they're trying to do. And it's going to look pretty implausible straight from the beginning. Okay, so the first philosopher, a guy named Thales, says, I tell you what the arche is, it's water. Everything that exists is made up of water. Water is ultimately the only thing that exists. Okay, so a couple things I should say. Number one, that sounds absolutely crazy. Number two, keep in mind, these people are, man, they're really, really smart. Okay, brilliant. So when somebody who's otherwise brilliant says something that seems on the surface stupid, you have to try to figure out what reason would they have for holding this. And here's some evidence for how brilliant these ancient Greek philosophers were. You know, we talk about people who believe the earth is flat. And we talk about, everybody back a certain time believed the earth is flat. No. Okay. Not only did the pre-Socratic philosophers know the earth was a sphere, they calculated the diameter of that sphere very, very accurately. They also calculated to a great degree of accuracy the distance from the earth to the moon. Okay? And they did this just with essentially geometry, okay, by measuring shadows in various locations. So, I mean, they're brilliant. You don't really find any. I mean, even the common layperson in the ancient world didn't really believe the earth was flat. I mean, all they had to do is watch a ship sail out in the ocean, right, and watch it gradually disappear from the top down, and you would that'd be going over a curve. So the big problem that they had, the big fear was not that you're going to sail out and fall off. The big fear was that you're going to sail out, and what's going to be out there, you're going to have new sources of food and water. That's what they didn't know, right? So you don't really find any flat earthers until you get to the 20th century, the 19th, 20th century. So no, the ancient people were incredibly wise. It's us that are foolish. I don't know. But anyway, water. So Thales thinks everything is water. Now, here's a problem with the pre-Socratics. They wrote some stuff, but we don't have it. Like what we have, for the most part, from Thales, all we have are a few fragments. Okay, and then most of what we know from Thales comes from Aristotle, but Aristotle lived in the 300s. Thales lived in the 600s. So we got a 300-year difference. So is Aristotle actually reporting what Thales thought, or is Aristotle making up a bunch of stuff? We don't really. But here's what Aristotle says. Aristotle says Thales might have believed this because he's clear. He's not telling us what Thales thinks. He's just trying to sort of tell us what reasons he might have for believing this. One, water is everywhere. Okay, so that's some evidence that everything is water. Water is necessary for life. Okay, you'll die without food, you'll die faster without water, is the case. I mean, your water makes the biggest portion of what you are, right? Water makes up the biggest portion of what the earth is, so on. And also, water is the only thing that under natural conditions can exist as three basic kinds of things: a solid, liquid, and a gas. There are other things, like, let's say hydrogen is a gas under natural conditions. It can be a liquid, right? But it has to be very highly compressed, and it just doesn't exist like that in a natural state. But water does. Okay, so that's it. Except, it seems like he's got a problem. Okay, what particular problem would there be for his theory? Any ideas? Well, let me give you a hint here. Okay, in ancient science, it was commonly thought, everybody thought there are four basic kinds of things. Okay, it's four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So which one of those is a problem for Thales? Fire. Okay, right. Why? Because if Thales is right, fire just is water. Okay, you add more water to it, what should happen to it? It should get bigger. Instead, it goes out. Okay, so the claim here by this next guy, who is called Anaximander says those four elements, they are fundamentally incompatible with each other, which means you can't reduce any three down to another one of them. Okay, so he thought fire and water got a problem together, earth and air have a problem. Okay, they're incompatible with each other. But there has to be something that it all really is. So what is it? Well, he calls it in Greek the aperon. Yeah, this is best translation for that in his usage is going to be the indefinite. It's something that we can't say what it is. Okay, because it once we can observe it, it's taken on the qualities of earth, air, fire, and water. Okay, but this is basically an unobservable entity. Okay, something that we hypothesize to explain what we can observe. And that's we'll get to this next guy in a little bit. But I mean, in some ways you can think of these are the people that sort of are. This is science just starting, right? So I mean, he may be wrong about what he's postulating, but they do this all the time in physics. Okay, for example, electrons, right? Anybody seen an electron? There are electron microscopes, but they're not called that because you can see the electrons, right? So what you do to you do an experiment to verify the presence of electrons. It's called cloud chamber experiment. What it does is you put a piece of photographic film there. The electron leaves a streak of light, which creates a streak on the photographic film. Okay, that's the thing. And people say it's an electron. No, it's a streak on a piece of photographic film, right? So what we're doing is postulating unobservable entities to explain what we do observe. He's the first person to really do that. Next guy that comes along is Anaximenes. These people are hard to keep straight. There are three pre-Socratic philosophers that all start with A-N-A-X. Anaximander, Anaximenes, and Anaxagoras. So they're easy to confuse. Anaximenes says, well, no, we shouldn't postulate this entity if we don't need it. Okay, this is another principle that tends to get used a lot in science, and you call that the priority of observation. So those unobservable entities, you're welcome to postulate those things, but you should only do it if they're absolutely required, right? If you can explain your perception in terms of things that you can actually perceive with your senses, that's what you ought to limit it to. Don't go to the unobservable until you need it. This is going to drive a principle. It's called Occam's razor. Okay, so there are various ways of forming that. One is simpler explanations are preferred to more complex explanations. But most of the time in science, it's used in terms of again, don't postulate entities unnecessarily. Okay, so Anaximenes says we don't need the indefinite. We can do it all with air. Fire is really thin air. Earth is really thick air. And that didn't go very far. Okay, so he's more important for this principle of the priority of observation than he is for his actual theory. All right. Now, there's a problem that's driving the next two people that we're going to talk about, and it's called the problem of change. So this is a big struggle in ancient philosophy, and nobody gives a really decent answer to Aristotle, but let's just see what the problem is. The problem is that it looks like change is, just like fire is incompatible with water, change is incompatible with permanence. Okay? So, but the problem is the world seems to contain both change and permanence and stability. Okay, how do we account for those two things? So, let's say the trees outside the building, they all have leaves now. By the end of the semester, they won't, right? So they will have changed. Are they the same trees? What does it mean to be the same? It hasn't changed. Okay. What does it mean to change? It's not the same anymore. So how can we reconcile change with sameness? Do you see the issue? Okay, again, we don't have a good answer to that until we get to Aristotle, but these next two people are the people that struggle with it. First is Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, no, there is no permanence, there is only change. And Heraclitus wrote a bunch of stuff. So that's good news. Okay, so we've got a person, we actually have a lot of his writings. The bad news, what Heraclitus said were a bunch of sort of mysterious little sayings without explaining any of them. So we have to figure out what's he talking about. Okay, one of the things that he said is that you can't step into the same river twice, which you'll hear if you watch the Disney movie Pocahontas. They just stole it from Heraclitus. Okay. Actually, Heraclitus said it a little bit differently than that, but why? Why would you think you can't step in the same river twice?
The water washes downstream.
Yeah, absolutely. So Heraclitus says, what's a river? All a river is the water between the banks, right? So you step into the water, you step into the river, you're stepping into some water, step out, that water is gone. There's new water there. New water equals new river, okay? So the point here is that the river is constantly changing. And he thought everything else was like that too. Everything is constantly changing. There are things that seem to be stable and permanent, but that permanence is just an illusion. That stability is just an illusion. Everything is constantly changing. And this change he called the flux. Okay, everything is in flux. Let's see. No permanence, no stability. Any stability that you perceive is just a perceptual illusion. Okay. Back up here, we'll say one more thing. Okay, so any stability that you see is just an illusion. But that change, that flux, it's not chaotic. Okay, trees get leaves in the spring, keep them through the summer. They turn brown in most Oklahoma summers, but then they fall off in autumn. Don't have them during the winter, back to the spring, get them again, right? It comes in sort of a cycle. So it's not random, it's not chaotic. And the thing that he thought governed this change is something he called the logos, okay? Which, where you know that word? Where does that come from? John 1:1. In the beginning was the logos. In arche ein ha logos in Greek, right? So the logos in the beginning was the. And so in John, this is translated word. It's a Greek, one of many Greek words that have lots of different meanings. So it means word, reason, account. So here he's using it as reason, as a rational principle, right, that governs that change. Okay, the next person is Parmenides. Parmenides wrote a book. It's again, compared to Thales, where we just have a few sentence fragments, right? That's a good thing. Now, what we have is the book had two parts. One is called The Way of Reality, the other is The Way of Illusion, or The Way of Appearance. So we don't have hardly anything of the way of appearance. That's bad, but good news is if you're going to lose one of those, and only have one, you want to have what he thinks the way of reality is. Okay, so and we've got all of that. Bad news is, well, it's poetry, and he's a really bad poet. So this is not. It has not gone down as one of the classics of Greek literature. Okay, but here, back to the good news. Okay, he's the first person in the history of philosophy to actually give an argument for his position. The other people are just telling us what they believe, and we're making up the arguments. Okay, he's got an argument, so that's good. Bad news, it's strange. Okay, so what in the world does it mean? Well, here's the argument. He says first premise. For anything, right? Either that thing is, it is not, or it's both. Okay, no other possibilities, right? Either it is, it's not, or it's both. Okay, then he says it can't be both. To say it's both is confused in his language. What would he say? It's a contradiction. Contradictions are always false, right? So that means either it is or it's not. Well, now he's going to reject one of those. He says to say that it's not is, that's actually impossible to speak and impossible to think. So it is not is impossible to speak of or conceive, is how it's phrased. So he conclusion, it is. All right. That's a valid argument. Is it a valid argument? It's either A, B, or C. It's not C, it's not B, it's got to be A, right? So it's a valid argument. What premise do you think is the problematic premise?
3.
Yeah, it's got to be 3. 1 has to be true, right? He's exhausted all the logical possibility there. 2, if that's a claim, contradictions are always false. That's true too. So if there's a problem, it's got to be 3. And if you think about it, 3 seems awfully shaky. Surely we can think of things that don't exist, right? What's an example? Okay, man. It's a first example anybody ever comes up with, right? And people have been putting them on tapestries since the early medieval period and stuff. So unicorns seems apparently do not exist. So okay, then you can say, Parmenides, I can prove you to be wrong because I'm thinking of a unicorn right now, right? I'm conceiving of something that does not exist. Not only am I thinking of it, but I'm actually talking about it too. So, all right. So why believe 3? Well, here's his reason. Here's an argument for believing 3. And again, the argument's pretty powerful. It can't be right, okay? But it's pretty powerful argument. And I think the argument would go something like this. What does it, let's do the thinking first, I guess. If you're thinking of something that does not exist, you're literally thinking of what? It is no thing, okay? Right? Doesn't exist. It's not a thing. So you are thinking of, strictly speaking, nothing. Can you think of nothing? Has anybody ever told you, you ask, what are you thinking about, and they say nothing?
Never means nothing.
Yes. Just be married for a while, okay? What that really means is, I'm thinking of something, but I don't want to tell you what it is right now, right? or yeah, I'm thinking of something, but you don't want to go there, right? Yeah, so you can't, to think of nothing, strictly speaking, is just to not think. Okay, does this make sense? So you have to have some content. There has to be something that you're thinking about. Okay, and the speaking part, how do words get their meaning? So we got a word, desk. How does it get its meaning? Well, let's say I make up a word like bumblefart, okay, and you ask me what does that word refer to? And I say, well, it doesn't refer to anything. Is it really a word? It doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't have any content, right? So it seems like words get their meaning by referring to things that exist. Podium means these things, right? Chair means those things. So stool means this thing, right? Does it make sense? Okay, so if you're using a word that doesn't refer to anything, then what? You're just making sounds. You're not saying anything. Okay, does this make sense? Okay, so here's Parmenides' position. If it doesn't exist, you are referring to, again, nothing. So, make sense? Yeah.
All right, so with the unicorn argument, is there a sense that we could say it does exist because people have spoken it into being?
Yeah.
Common knowledge of what
Yeah.
a unicorn is?
Yeah, you could, right? But you get into these problems, okay? And again, it's how you. You remember when I said the problem of change? Nobody's got a good solution until Aristotle. This thing, nobody's got a good solution until the 1950s. Okay, because it's a deep and mysterious problem. So the easiest way out of it is to do something like along the lines of what I think you're talking about, is to say, no, I'm referring to something. What I'm referring to is this common idea that we have. Okay, but then you think, well, in order for it to be a unicorn, it has to have certain properties, and they're not the kinds of properties that ideas can really have. Right? So what is a unicorn? Yeah. Ideas are not horses. Do you see? And ideas don't have horns. So how do we talk? How? And also, if here's a like a deeper core problem. If what unicorn refers to is just an idea, then my claim that unicorns do not exist is what? Is false. Do you see? Okay, so we can go that way, and that seems to get us out of some trouble, but then it immediately gets us into other trouble, is the thing. Yeah, this is why it's such a deep problem. So, but again, 1950s, a guy named Bertrand Russell comes up with a way logically to handle those things. So, now the fact that it takes how long? over 2,000 years, right, to come up with a good solution. Tells us how difficult the problem was. All right, well, let's move on. It is. What is it, and what is it like? Here's what Parmenides says. It is eternal, it's unchanging, and there's only one. He thought it was a sphere. There's actually a good reason, given his assumptions, to think that reality is spherical. Because on a sphere, do you have any points that you can differentiate from any other points? If it's a perfect sphere and I turn it 180 degrees, okay, you look at it before, you look at it after, you're not going to be able to tell the difference, right? Does it make sense? Now, if it were a cube, you can tell the difference. You could tell that something changed if we, let's say, have it flat on its side or balance on one of the points, right? You could tell. But Parmenides thinks reality is spherical. It's eternal. It's unchanging. There's only one. Why is it eternal? Because if it were not eternal, it would be going from what is not to what is, but what is not is impossible, right? So it can't come into being, it can't pass away. Change is impossible. Change is going from what it was not to what is. Again, that's impossible. If there were two things, there would be something that it's not, okay? But is not is, again, impossible. All right, that's a strange position.
Yeah, so if he thought that it was eternal, so it couldn't come into being and it couldn't go out of being, did he not believe in any sort of God or God at this time, or?
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, you could call that thing divine. Here's the thing about the pre-Socratics' religious views are awfully hard to figure out. They talked about God all the time. Okay. But what it looks like is that they tended to think that whatever the arche was divine. So, yeah. What you don't get them talking about is any kind of nature of a personal God. Okay, does that make sense? And some of them were really skeptical about religion, period. There's one whose name, oh man, I can't think of it off the top of my head. But he said, I think this is an interesting claim. He really was noticing a lot about different religions. He said, you know, we Greeks, we have gods, right? We make statues of those gods. And what do those statues look like? He said, well, you notice, you look at all of them, they've all got fair skin and they've got straight hair. But if I go down to Africa, right, and I see statues of their gods, they all have dark skin and curly hair. And his next line was, well, if cows could have gods, they would all have horns and moo. Okay, so his point is that, and this is something I think that we struggle with in Christianity, right? He says there's a human tendency not to think that we are created in God's image, to force God to be made in our image, right? And there's a writer, Anne Lamott. Have you ever heard of her? She's got this brilliant line. She says, yeah, if your God conveniently loves all the people that you love and hates all the people that you hate, she said, maybe you're creating God in your own image rather than the other way around, right? Yeah, so I do think this is something that we have to struggle against. How much do we, of our biblical interpretation, do we force onto the Scripture, right? Because this is what we want God to be rather than, so just pointed out there. All right, that's more than what you asked, but yeah, they do, but it's not at all clear, okay? They tend to talk about God, but they, in a sense, we would probably look at that and say, well, what you're calling divine isn't really divine. I mean, I think what they are mostly were kind of early scientific naturalists that just didn't have the language to express what they wanted to express. So, okay, well, now here's a guy that's so fun to talk about. So, Zeno. Zeno is a student of Parmenides because there's an obvious objection to Parmenides. Say, Parmenides, I can prove you wrong. Look at my hand, Parmenides. It is over here. I move it over here, right? There is motion. Motion is what? Change of location. Okay, so you're witnessing change right now, Parmenides. Parmenides is going to say, oh, that's just an illusion. Well, prove to me it's just an illusion. So Zeno says, I can take that up. I can give you a proof. Not only one proof, I can give you 4 or 5 different proofs. I'm going to give you 2. Okay, so I didn't want to put those on the slides because I put some on a slide. You want to write it all down? Okay. And so on Canvas, I put a page on Canvas where I listed those arguments and premises and conclusion. So the 2 that are I think interesting, easy to understand are the midpoint argument, the arrow argument. He's got another called Achilles and the Tortoise that, in my opinion, is really no different from the midpoint argument. And then he's got another one called the Stadium. That is different, but it's really about a different conclusion, I think. So, and these are interesting. Okay, the Stadium argument is really an argument that shows that motion is relative. Einstein tells us that. Okay, Zeno's way ahead of his time. is the case. He doesn't have any math to back it up, but he's way ahead of his time in that case. Okay, midpoint argument. Zeno says, in order to move from point A to point B, okay, we label them that because we want them to be arbitrary. Before you can complete the journey from A to B, you first have to complete the journey from A to the midpoint. Okay, is that true? Yes, seems true. Okay, but before you can complete the journey from A to that midpoint, you've got to complete a journey from A to a further, closer midpoint, right? True? Okay, how many of these midpoints are there? Infinite number of midpoints. So before you can complete the journey from A to B, you first have to complete an infinite number of journeys. Is it possible to complete an infinite number of journeys? Obviously no, so therefore it's impossible to move from A to B. This is called a paradox. These are called Zeno's paradoxes of motion. A paradox is an argument that has apparently true premises using apparently valid reasoning to lead to an obviously false conclusion. Okay. So how do you respond to a paradox? You got some options. Well, you could just bite the bullet and say, I guess that conclusion is not false. Okay. Or you can show, I know it looks like this is valid, but it's really not. Or you can show, I know this premise looks like it's really true, but it's really not. Okay. So, and it turns out the deeper the paradox, the harder it is to do that. So, okay, let's do the arrow argument. This one I think is interesting too. So Zeno says, imagine an arrow that was shot through the air. Okay, let's take a snapshot of that arrow. Okay, at any point in time, that arrow is at some location in space, right? Okay, now let's assume that it's moving. Then we ask the question, where is it moving? Well, it's either moving where it is or it's moving where it's not. Okay, can something move where it's not? Nothing can do anything where it's not. Okay. So this in contemporary physics is called the no action at a distance principle. So this is driving some disputes in quantum mechanics. So no action at a distance. Things can only act on things where they are, and then what would be an example? No action at a distance. Oh, here. I'm seeing a little spot on the column up there. I can't even see what it is. Put my glasses back on, I guess. But there's something up there, right? Okay. And all right. So that thing is acting on my visual perception. At my age, my visual perception is not that good, so it's a little fuzzy, but no problem. It's still acting on my visual perception, right? Okay, is it acting directly on my visual perception? No action at a distance. So what's it directly acting on? Well, it's directly reflecting some light. That light is traveling through the air, right? Then that light is what's directly acting on my visual perception system, you see? So things act immediately on things where they are. They act mediated, right, at places where they're not. But so it's really just a chain. Okay, that's the claim. Okay, so it can't be moving where it's not, can't do anything where it's not. So it must be moving where it is. Can it be moving where it is? Zeno says no. Why? Because it takes up all that space. Okay? There's no room for it to move there. Does it make sense? Yeah, that's an interesting argument. That's a really interesting argument. Now, won't go into the details, but the contemporary response to Zeno is, well, Zeno, if you just had some calculus, right, then you could explain this midpoint argument. But that we don't want to hold against Zeno. We don't want to say, Zeno, you should have had better math when that math didn't come around until the 1600s. But that seems to be, but that's not even clear. I've got a copy of Scientific American from maybe 20 years ago, where a couple of mathematicians who work in what's called the mathematics of infinitesimals wrote an article. The headline was, "Here's why we can finally prove Zeno was wrong." Now, I wish I could come up with some bad argument that people 2,000 years ago were still arguing about what was wrong with it. That's as good as it gets in philosophy. So, moving on. Here's the key point. For both Heraclitus and Parmenides, although they radically disagree with each other about the nature of reality, they both agree on one thing. What reality is radically different from the way it appears to be. Okay. This is called sometimes the problem of appearance. Appearance and reality. Metaphysician in the 20th century, F.H. Bradley, wrote a book called Appearance and Reality. There's the way things appear to be, and then there's the way they really are. Are they always the same? Put the stick in the water, the stick appears to be bent, right? We don't think it's bent. So appearance does not match reality. But what's the problem? Once you concede that appearance may not be reality, what's your problem?
Who can you trust?
Yeah, how do you know what reality really is? Because our only avenue to the real external world seems to be the way it appears to us to be. Right? Does this make sense? And this is the problem. Okay, most of the time as adults, we don't even worry about it. Kids, though, kids are sort of natural-born philosophers. So I've got a couple of books on philosophy in children, and it's got some sort of case studies. There was a child who I think this is great. This little boy grew up near an airport in his city. So his whole 4 years of life, let's say, is filled with observing planes taking off and coming in for a landing. Okay. So now at age 4, his parents are taking him on a trip somewhere and requires going on a plane. And he gets on the plane, and they can see the kid is just really nervous. No surprise there. People are and fear of flying is pretty common, right? So I'm going up, how do I know the plane can really fly? Stuff like that. No big deal. But what was interesting is that although they tried to calm him down, nothing seemed to work. And then after a while, it just ended. So he's really nervous, and then he's just fine, right? But nothing seems to have changed. So they were asking him, what was going on? And he said, wow, things really don't get smaller and smaller here. Okay, so what his fear was not that the plane would crash. His fear was grounded in this appearance, right? He had watched these planes take off. They get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they disappear, right? That's what he was afraid was going to happen to him. So, and when it turned out it didn't disappear and things didn't really get smaller, he's relieved. So, okay, so it's this appearance and reality problem that he was struggling with. Okay, next, Socrates. We got 30 minutes. We're doing fine. Socrates. I went to graduate school with a couple of people from Greece, and also with a guy from New Jersey that liked to annoy the people from Greece. So he would always call Socrates Socrates, and they would respond by saying Descartes, right? So in Greek it's Socrates. We'll stick with Socrates. I'm from Oklahoma. Who was Socrates? Socrates is a teacher of Plato. Plato is a teacher of Aristotle. Okay, sort of. Plato, Aristotle, teacher of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, he just conquered the world. He didn't teach anybody. Socrates, I don't really, that's probably not really true, okay? Socrates is not the teacher of Plato. Plato's the disciple of Socrates in a sense, right? Because Socrates he wouldn't make a very good teacher. Why? Because he claimed he didn't know anything. That's not, I mean, if I came into class with Socrates and I said, well, here, what are we going to learn today? Nothing. I don't know anything, can't teach it. You're going to wonder, why am I paying all this money to go to OBU, right? Yeah. So Socrates claimed to be ignorant. Do you know the basic story of Socrates? Socrates, the story goes, and this comes from a dialogue called the Apology, Socrates' self-defense at his trial, right? So Socrates it was accused of believing in the wrong gods and corrupting the youth. So so Socrates has to sort of explain why he does what he does. And the story went like this. A friend of Socrates went to the Oracle at Delphi. You've heard of that? So there's a Greek temple, still there. You can go visit the site and so on. It's built over a lot of volcanic activity in the region. It's built over essentially sort of this, where the volcanic fumes go up. These volcanic fumes were supposed to put the priestess into a higher level of consciousness, okay? Not incidentally like some of the people I went to college with my freshman year. That for various reasons didn't come back their sophomore year. They thought that they were in a higher state of consciousness from some fumes that they were inhaling. What you would do is you would pay a lot of money and you ask the priestess a question, and the priestess would inhale the fumes, give you an answer, right? Now, it's a temple to the god Apollo. The thought was the answer had to be true because it's coming from the god. Okay, makes sense? All right, now, if you were in the business of giving prophecies, what kind of prophecies would you give to ensure that you continue in business? You want to make sure that your prophecies are always going to come out to be true, so how are you going to?
Be as general as possible.
Yeah. So it's like if you're going to go into business writing fortune cookie things, right? So what do you want? You want, something good is going to happen to you today. Well, by the end of the day, something good happened. Well, you didn't die, I guess, right? it's the thing. So you want them to be true no matter how they work out. The best way to do that is to make them vague. For instance, the king of Lydia, Persia is pushing west from the east. The king of Lydia goes to the Oracle at Delphi, pays a lot of money, asks the question, should I go to war with Persia? Okay, Persia, the mightiest empire of the time, Lydia, small little kingdom. Okay, the oracle replies, if you go to war, a great kingdom will fall. Okay, the Lydian king says, I've got nothing to lose. The oracle said, Persia will fall. Well, it goes to war with Persia, a great kingdom falls. It happens to be the kingdom of Lydia, not the kingdom of Persia, right? So it would have worked out to be true, no matter what happened is the case. So now, but this one is a little bit different because the guy comes in and he asks a direct question: is it true that Socrates is the wisest of all people? And the oracle replies, yes. Okay, so he goes back to Socrates and he said, guess what the oracle told me. Now, why the guy paid all that money to ask that question, I don't know, but that's not part of the story. You're the oracle says you're the wisest person. And Socrates said, well, now we have a problem. Okay, the problem is that can't be true because I know how ignorant I am, right? And there are other people that seem to know a lot more than I do. So it can't be true, yet it must be true because the God cannot lie. So then Socrates goes on what he thinks is a divine mission. He's on a mission from God to interpret the oracle. So he goes to a lot of people who ought to know things about certain subjects and sort of quizzes them on those things. The outcome of those, and we talked about this when we talked about Meno's paradox, right? The outcome of all these interactions is you think that you know a lot, but it doesn't appear that you know anything about this subject, okay? And Socrates says, I don't know anything either. Come join me in the search for truth, right? But at the trial, Socrates says, I guess the God is right, okay? I am the wisest of all because I recognize my own ignorance, and those other people foolishly believe that they're not, okay? Makes sense? So he claimed ignorance, yet it seems like he has certain controversial views. So, number one, Socrates seems to believe that knowledge is virtue, and virtue is knowledge. Strictly speaking, knowledge is necessary and sufficient for virtue. To say that knowledge is necessary for virtue is to say that you can't be virtuous unless you know what virtue is. You can't be courageous unless you know what courage is. Okay? I think you can make a plausible case for that. So, because if you're a courageous person, it's not just the case that you're accidentally courageous, right? That's you accidentally do the brave thing. Best example I have here is I'm sure this is an apocryphal story, okay? But the story goes after they filmed the movie Jaws. Has anybody seen that movie? I saw that when I was like in junior high school. Scared the crap out of me. I've never seen it since. Yeah. But after so the story goes after they filmed the movie, they had a big set party, okay, which is pretty common. They invite all the people who work on the film. So it's at the producer's house. The producer's got a big swimming pool there in Los Angeles at his home. And the producer thought it would be funny to put a couple of sharks in the pool, okay? Not huge, great white sharks, but sharks swimming around there. So, and when people came, he said, I'll pay $1,000, right, to anybody who would swim across the pool. And everybody just laughs and goes on. And then at a certain point in the night, they hear a splash in the pool, and of course everybody turns around real quick, right? And they see this guy swimming furiously across the pool. Gets out the other side, and the producer comes over and he says, well, I was really just joking, right? But I'm a man of my word. Gets out his checkbook, starts writing out the check, and the guy says, look, I don't want your money. All I want to know is who pushed me in the pool. So the point being here is did he do a brave thing? He didn't really do anything. Something was done to him, right? Did you see? So in order for you to be courageous, it's got to be the case that you be able to know what's the courageous thing to do in a situation. But it seems like you can't do that unless you know what courage is, right? Okay, so I think that's a pretty plausible case. The other side, though, says knowledge is sufficient for virtue. And what that means is if you know what the right thing to do is, you'll do it. Is that plausible? Who in the history of human thought believes that? Socrates. Not Plato, not Aristotle, not the Apostle Paul in Romans 7, right? Who says, I know all the time what the right thing is. I just can't do it. So, that's not very plausible. But again, Socrates can make a pretty plausible argument. And the argument goes something like this. Is it better for you in the long run to be virtuous or not? Is it better for you to be a good person or a bad person in the long run? You might think it's better for you to be a good person. Do you want what's better for you? Or do you want what's worse for you? Everybody wants what's better for them, right? So if somebody's not being good, they must not know that it's better for them to be good than bad, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a pretty plausible argument. So how do we get out of that? Plato tries, Aristotle tries, various cases. So still a crazy view. So that means there's no such thing as weakness of will. Weakness of will is when you know the right thing to do, but you just can't do it. Okay, that seems to be a really common feature of human personality, right? So do you have? I don't need to know what it is, right? But every person has their sort of weakness as far as this is the temptation that I'm more likely to get into, give into. For me, it's, that was a really good piece of cake. Would you like another? No, I shouldn't. Yes. Or I'm saying, no, I shouldn't as I take the plate that's offered, right? So that's the thing. Okay, if Socrates is right, that's impossible. I'm doing it out of ignorance, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So how do we explain it? He also thought the virtues were unified in a certain way, unity of the virtues. If you hold the doctrine of the unity of the virtues, it's either you have them all or you don't have any. Okay, you can't have courage unless you also have charity and wisdom and so on. Okay, that also seems wrong, right? I don't hold the virtue equals knowledge, but actually I think I can make a good case for the unity of the virtues. I do think you can have a virtue to an extent without having the others, but I think I can make a good case that you can't be fully virtuous without those other things. So there's a case where I think he was right. Also, he says it is better to be harmed than to harm someone else. Okay, again, on the surface, people might say this seems crazy, right? Socrates pushed it to an extent where it does seem crazy. Socrates is willing to say, if you are a virtuous person, you're happy, even if you're being tortured. Aristotle said that's just nuts, right? Virtue is necessary for happiness, but you also need some other things as well. But here's Socrates' argument. When you are harmed, that is a harm to your body. Okay? When you harm someone else, you're harming their body, but by that act you are harming your own soul. And a harm to the soul is worse than a harm to the body. So interesting case there. There's something to agree with. All right, so that's Socrates. Now, here's Socrates' method. Okay, here's what Socrates did. And we won't talk too much about it because we already talked about it a little bit when we did the Meno. Socrates is looking for, now he believes knowledge is necessary and sufficient for virtue. That means knowing what a virtue is incredibly important for him, right? You can't be courageous if you don't know what courage is. So he goes around to all these people asking for these definitions. I need to know what this means. Now, here's his criteria for a definition. He's looking for the feature that all courageous acts have and a set of features that only courageous acts have. Okay? And it's the thing that makes them courageous. Okay? It's because of these that they are courageous. So all and only courageous actions have, and it's the thing that makes them what they are. So what he's really looking for is something like a mathematical definition, right? The definition of a triangle. A triangle is a closed plane, three-sided figure. Okay, so that means anything that is a three-sided closed plane figure is a triangle, and only triangles are three-sided closed plane figures, right? What makes it a triangle? Because it's a three-sided closed plane figure, that sort of thing. So once you understand that, you'd be able to pick out courageous actions from non-courageous actions in every case. Okay, good. And here's how it worked. He'd go in, ask the person, what's the definition of courage? He asks Leakes the general. Leakes replies, here's courage. Socrates says, asks other things about other things that Leakes believes and shows that those are inconsistent with his original answer. Leakes gives up the definition, says here's definition 2. Socrates does the same thing, gives up that. Here's definition 3. That doesn't work either. And then Socrates says, well, guess you don't know? Come join me in the search for truth. Okay, that's how they work. Now, by the time that Socrates finishes, we got some unresolved questions. How do we get this knowledge that Socrates wants? Okay, does Socrates tell us how to get the knowledge? Why not? He's ignorant. Okay, he doesn't tell us how to get the knowledge. Can we see by his activity that he's doing how to get the knowledge? No, because we haven't seen it successful in any way, right? So, so how do we get this knowledge? There's a big puzzle there. What kinds of things can meet this criteria that Socrates? The things that all and only these things have, and the things that make them what they are, right? What sort of thing will fit the requirements for the definition? And then here's a final thing. I mean, Socrates is really, he's not interested in metaphysics. He's only doing ethics, okay? He wants to know what these virtues are. Well, let's say you say what these virtues are. Let's say we figure it out, okay? Here's what courage is. Why should I be courageous? Okay, does that make sense? Somebody said, oh yeah, I know that's the right thing to do, but why should I do it? Okay, what are they asking? Natural way to phrase this is, what's in it for me? Okay, why? And this is a common theme throughout ancient ethics, is egoism. You should do what's in your best interest. Well, is it always in your best interest to do what's virtuous? So, yeah, man, DB. Okay, plenty of people faced with a dilemma during their college education. I didn't study for this test, but she did. Okay, I'm sitting right next to her. So, is it better for me to cheat, not cheat? Well, it's not better for you if you don't get caught. That's certainly true. Okay, messed that up. It's not better for you if you get caught, correct? Because if you get caught, I'll fail you on the exam and I'll send a note to the provost. Got one on my computer already filled out, right, that I have set in the past. They probably won't kick you out. You just failed. That's not good. But what if you don't get caught? Are you better off? Well, you might think, look, if I get caught, I'm going to fail this exam. If I don't cheat, I'm going to what? I'm going to fail this exam. What have I got to lose? Okay? Make sense? I'm not arguing for that position. Don't do it. Okay? don't do it. But you just think, okay, that seems to be rational. Okay? So what's in it for me? Why should I do the right thing if it's going to be a cost to me? Socrates doesn't give us any answer to that either. So, then we move to Plato. At a certain point in Plato's writings, this is a bad thing about Socrates. Socrates did not write anything, period. Okay? It all comes from other people, predominantly Plato. The problem with Plato's writings about Socrates is that Socrates doesn't look like this person over here called Socrates is the same as this person over here called Socrates. We got a person over here who claims to know nothing. Then we've got a person over here named Socrates that knows all kinds of things and goes on these long speeches teaching people stuff, right? Can't be the same person. So the thought is, and I think I've said this before, there are certain dialogues where you think this accurately reflects Socratic thought, and then there are other dialogues where there's a character named Socrates, but he's speaking Plato's words, okay? So Plato comes along, and Plato says, he's got theories of epistemology, he's got metaphysics, and it all starts in the Meno. So we don't need to go back to that. You remember Meno's paradox? And Meno's paradox in the dialogue occurs right after where all the other dialogues end, where Socrates says, I don't know either, come join me in the search for truth. Meno comes back, says, I don't see how it's possible, gives this argument. Look back in your notes and you see what the argument is. And then Socrates, at that point, not the real Socrates, but Socrates the character, right, gives Plato's theory. Plato's theory, called the theory of recollection. Oh, you existed in this previous life, and there you got all the knowledge, and now you're just remembering it, right? So the act of teaching is not giving you new knowledge, it's pulling that knowledge out of you. Okay? Is that a good theory? Is that a plausible theory? Does it have a problem? Must have a problem because Plato gave it up pretty quickly. And the problem is, if it's impossible for you to gain knowledge in this life, how is it possible for you to gain knowledge in that previous life? Okay? We have to push it back one step, but there's no point at which we initially gain the knowledge. So it seems like knowledge is in fact impossible. All right, so no more about that. But here's some things that Plato seems to, he changes his theory about how you get it, but he never changes his ideas of what knowledge is. Knowledge for Plato is certain. Knowledge requires certainty. You can't know something that you're not sure about. Okay? And that seems plausible. I think it's a position we ought to give up because it leads to skepticism, but it initially seems plausible. And one reason it seems plausible is that's how we use the word, right? If a person says to you, "I know that this is true," what are they saying? All they're really saying is, "I'm certain that this is true." Does this make sense? So we tend to equate knowledge with certainty. He also thinks knowledge is enduring. If you know something now, that knowledge will not change. Okay. That's not saying that you don't forget. Well, what it's really saying is that fact that you know now, that fact can't change. Okay. So certain, enduring, unchanging, same thing as enduring. So facts do not change. Our knowledge does not. Okay, what is this like? It's like mathematical knowledge. Okay. Plato had a sign outside his school called the Academy, and it said something like, "Do not enter here unless you have studied geometry." So those are we think about knowledge in mathematics. That's what Plato thinks all knowledge is like, right? Okay, why is that? Because you can think. Let's move on. We'll look at a particular example. Okay, so how do we get this knowledge is certain? That's the question. Well, here's our example. What's the sum of the interior angles of a triangle? Okay, how was it? Double major in philosophy and math in college. Started out in physics. Physics was hard. So kept the math. Most of what I've learned in math in college I've forgotten. Okay, but I still know this. So 180 degrees. So now, how do we get that knowledge? How do we know that it's 180 degrees? Well, I can tell you how you don't know, and you don't know it from experience, right? You don't know it from doing some empirical tests. So, yeah, you remember being back in, let's say, high school math, and you had to measure all those angles using the protractor, right? A little plastic thing with lines that were so close together they were hard to see. Okay, do you remember? Well, the problem with learning that they equal 180 degrees from that is that most triangles, if I drew a triangle up on the board, it's not going to have angles that equal 180 degrees. Why? Because my artistic skills are not very good and I can't draw a straight line. Okay, does it make sense? So my triangles are probably going to come out to be 195 or something, right, with these curves at the corners. But even if you've got a nicely printed triangle, it may not come out to be 180 degrees. And even if it did come out to 180 degrees, you still couldn't be certain that it was 180 degrees. Why? Remember how close those lines are together. You can't tell the difference between 180 and 181. Do you see? And those tools, they all have a certain degree of tolerance. So when you measure something, what you ought to conclude is that it's 180 degrees plus or minus whatever the margin of error is. Do you see? So since all of your measurements are going to come out slightly different, your conclusion about triangles and their interior angles, if that is how you get the knowledge, should be, well, they're about 180 plus or minus whatever. Okay, so it's not from that. It's got to be from reason. How you know that is from reason, not vision in a sense. It's not the senses, it's your reason. Okay, now how you do it? You do the proof. The proof involves parallel lines and supplementary angles. Okay, so it's not too hard. Go back to geometry class. But the point is, it's your reason that gives you that knowledge. And since it's reason that gives you that knowledge, yes, okay, what triangle has angles that equal 180 degrees? It's not any triangle I draw. It's not any triangle that's printed in a book. It's what? What is it? Well, it's the perfect triangle. Does the perfect triangle exist? not in the world that we can see. Okay, yeah. So Plato has a word for these, and the word is, well, we call them the forms, Plato's forms. The word actually was idea in Greek. Okay, perfect triangle. So that's the triangle that we can get to by reason, not the senses. So, okay, it's an abstract mathematical object. The triangle, the circle. Okay, so these are not things that are actually visually perceivable. They're only perceivable via the senses, these abstract things. But for Plato, they're real. Okay, they are real. They're real features of the world. Now we got 3 minutes, so let's just cut to the chase. They are eternal, they are unchanging. What's it sound like so far?
Well, it sounds like
Reality.
It sounds like Parmenides the one, okay? Eternal, changing one, okay? But he thinks there's a bunch of them. They're known by reason. They are the things that we have true knowledge about. The things that I perceive by my senses, I can't have true knowledge about. Why? Because knowledge is enduring, those things are not. Essentially what Plato says is Heraclitus is right, Parmenides is right. Heraclitus is right about the world we perceive with our senses. Parmenides is right about the true reality of the world of the forms. Okay, but he says, look, I know this sounds crazy, and I can understand why it sounds crazy to you, because you just haven't had that access to the world of the forms. So he says, essentially, what you think ultimate reality is the thing you can perceive with your senses, because that's what you're seeing, right? But it's not. It's the forms. You are like somebody who is what? Moving on. I keep thinking I don't have another bullet point there, but I keep doing it. Okay. So these physical things are they're images. Images. Better word, given what he says in Republic 7, shadows. Okay. That you're living in a shadow world. There is a real world, though. And here's the shadows are less real than the real things. So he tells a story to sort of generate this. You're living in a cave. You've been in a cave from birth, okay? People are parading around these little stick figures to cast shadows on the wall. You see the shadows. You think the shadows are real. Somebody escapes from the cave. They see what reality is really like. They go back in and they say, oh, you think those are real. Here's what it's really like. And the people in the cave say what? You're nuts, right? Because they're just living in this sensory world. Okay, here's some pictures of this. This is the last thing I've got. Things I stole from the internet. Right? Nice picture of Greek figures. So the guy's sitting down there, he's seeing the bird shadow, he thinks that's real. Here's a better picture, sees the whole thing. We got somebody who's getting out. When they first get out, what do they see? Well, actually, the process of getting out is painful, right? Because they're blinded by the light of the sun. But then their eyes become accustomed to it, and they can see the beauty of the real world. Education is painful. He's making a whole point here in his allegory, right? But it's worthwhile. Here was my favorite. This is saying, yeah, we're still living in Plato's cave, right? So, because we tend to believe that these things that these media sources are presenting to us is what reality is, okay? But it's not. It's some particular image, a distortion of the real thing. We'd have to escape the cave and see it for ourselves, but we tend to just believe what we hear. So, yeah, there's a lot to be said for that, okay? For Plato, there's a real world. It's out there. It's not perceivable with the senses. Augustine's going to use the same thing. Okay, Augustine can tell a cave story in a sense. That real world's going to be a spiritual reality. Maybe Augustine's going to.
It sounds like the story of Socrates. You know what I mean? Like.
Well, the problem for Socrates, according to Plato, Socrates never makes it out of the cave. Okay, he's searching for the way, right? So you ought to learn from Socrates. But Socrates doesn't think. He's not like the people trapped there. Socrates knows there's something else, right? So you ought to emulate Socrates in continuing to search, right? But it's Plato thinks he can give the answers that Socrates is looking for. Good. Okay, I'll see you next week.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry for getting up and
Oh, no, that's
going.
fine. Things
So,
happen, right?
I want to let you know. So I'm from Louisiana.
Uh-huh.
and,
Oh, yeah.
And my town is like Charles and Sulphur.
Oh, really?
It's obliterated. There's
Yeah.
nothing left
Yeah,
at all.
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
But my family is safe. And,
Yeah, that's good.
My grandparents are found this morning.
Were
'cause
they- are they
didn't
all right?
leave. They're okay.
Yeah.
They're just trying to find a way out right
Are they?
now.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I just want to let you know, let all my other
Yeah.
professors know that
Yeah.
I'm going to be headed back home
Are
once
ya?
power
Okay.
is restored.
Yeah.
Because there's just a lot.
A lot of work to do.
I mean, our houses are completely
Yeah,
destroyed.
okay.
So,
Well, I'll be praying for your family.
so I'm going to email you
Okay.
when that time comes. They said around like
Yeah.
17 days before
Really?
the power is
Okay.
restored.
Uh-huh.
So I'll head back
Yeah.
for a few days just to
Okay,
help,
sure.
and then I'll
Yeah.
come back
Okay.
here.
Good.
But I'll continue to keep doing my work
Okay.
as long as power's
Yeah.
good and
Yeah.
I'm able to.
I understand.
But
Yeah.
I'll keep you updated.
All right. Perfectly
Thank you
understand.
so much.
Hi,
Yeah.
so on the
Uh-huh.
apology paper that we write at the
Yeah,
end
uh-huh.
of the year. Okay, so you said we kind of have covered what we're gonna cover for epistemology?
Yes.
Is that right? So it would be wise to start
Good.
working on
Yes.
that part of the
That
apology?
would be wise.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there a
Good.
time where I could possibly just kind of like talk through that?
Yeah, come to my office hours
Okay.
anytime. Yeah,
Alright.
Monday through Thursday, 2 to 4.
Cool.
Okay?
Thank you.
Good.